In the abandoned mining camps of 1867 Colorado, mountain man Ezra McKinnon discovered something that shattered his 20 years of solitude. A 12-year-old boy locked in an iron cage with a wooden sign reading, "Worthless," hanging from the bars. But when 3 armed men arrived in the dead of night, claiming the boy belonged to them, would Ezra's decision to free the child cost them both their lives? A gunshot echoed through the Colorado mountains, sending a flock of ravens into the gray September sky. Ezra McKinnon lowered his rifle and watched the elk he'd been tracking for 3 days disappear into the thick pine forest. He'd missed. At 52 years old, his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and winter was coming fast to the high country. The wind carried the smell of snow from the peaks above. Ezra pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders and spit into the dirt. 20 years he'd been living alone in these mountains, ever since the war took everything that mattered to him. His wife Mary had died of fever while he was fighting rebels down in Kansas. His farm had been sold for taxes he couldn't pay from a hospital bed. His brother had written one letter saying the family didn't want to see him anymore. That was fine by Ezra. People brought nothing but pain. His pack mule, a stubborn gray animal he called stubborn because that's what it was, stood chewing on some mountain grass. The mule's ears twitched toward the valley below, where the old mining camp of Copper Falls sat empty and rotting. Ezra had been avoiding that place for months. Too many memories of the miners who used to buy his furs and jerky. Too many reminders that even rough men needed other people to talk to. But his supplies were running low. Coffee, salt, bullets, the things a mountain man couldn't make for himself. The nearest town was Pine Ridge, 3 days hard riding through dangerous passes. Copper Falls was just a few hours down the mountain. Maybe some of the miners had left useful things behind when the copper ran out and they all moved on. Ezra loaded his rifle and started down the narrow trail. Stubborn followed without being led, picking his way carefully over loose rocks and fallen logs. The morning mist hung thick in the valleys, making everything look like a ghost story. Eagles circled high overhead, riding the wind currents that flowed between the peaks like invisible rivers. Halfway down the mountain, Ezra stopped. Something was wrong. He'd lived in the wilderness long enough to trust his feelings, and right now every instinct was telling him to turn around. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He pulled out his spyglass and studied the abandoned camp below. Most of the buildings looked the same as always. Sagging roofs, broken windows, weeds growing through the wooden sidewalks. But there, in the center of what used to be the main street, something new caught his eye. Something that made his blood run cold. A cage, made of iron bars about the size of a large doghouse. And inside that cage, something was moving. Ezra's hands shook as he focused the spyglass. The shape inside the cage was small, hunched over, wearing what looked like torn clothes. As he watched, the figure lifted its head and looked around. It was a child. A boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, locked in a cage like an animal. "What in the Sam Hill?" Ezra muttered, lowering the spyglass. His first thought was to turn around and ride away. This wasn't his business. He'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles only led to more trouble. But something about the way the boy sat in that cage, so still and hopeless, reminded Ezra of a wounded animal he'd once found in a trap. He'd tried to walk away from that animal too, but his conscience wouldn't let him. He climbed back on Stubborn and started down the mountain again, this time moving faster. The trail switched back and forth down the steep slope, winding between tall pine trees and granite boulders bigger than houses. A small stream bubbled alongside the path, running clear and cold from the mountain snowfields above. As he got closer to the camp, Ezra could see more details. The cage was definitely man-made, with thick iron bars and a heavy padlock on the door. A wooden sign hung from the front of the cage, but he was still too far away to read what it said. The boy inside hadn't moved much, just shifted position now and then like he was trying to get comfortable on the hard ground. Ezra's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the boy was dangerous. Maybe he'd committed some terrible crime and this was his punishment. Maybe this was some kind of trap set by outlaws or hostile Indians. Maybe he should just keep riding and pretend he'd never seen anything. But as he reached the edge of the abandoned camp, Ezra could finally read the sign hanging on the cage. One word, burned deep into a piece of pine board. Worthless. The word hit him like a physical blow. He'd been called worthless himself, by army officers who thought farmers made poor soldiers, by doctors who said his war wounds would never heal right, by his own family who seemed to blame him for everything that had gone wrong. But to put that word on a child, to lock a boy in a cage like he meant nothing to the world, that was evil beyond Ezra's understanding. He dismounted and walked slowly toward the cage, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. Those eyes held no hope, no fear, just a kind of tired acceptance that made Ezra's heart ache. "Hello there, son," Ezra said softly, kneeling down beside the cage. Up close, he could see that the boy was thin to the point of starvation, his clothes little more than rags, his dark hair tangled and dirty. But his eyes were intelligent, alert, watching Ezra with careful attention. The boy didn't answer at first, just stared at this strange mountain man with the grizzled beard and kind voice. Finally, he spoke in a whisper so quiet Ezra had to lean closer to hear. "You ain't gonna hurt me, are you, mister?" The question broke something inside Ezra's chest. "No, son," he said firmly. "Nobody's gonna hurt you. Not while I'm here." The lock on the cage was old and rusted, but still strong enough to keep a small boy trapped inside. Ezra examined it carefully, looking for weakness in the metal or the way it attached to the cage door. The boy watched him work, hope beginning to flicker in those tired eyes like a candle flame in the wind. "What's your name, son?" Ezra asked as he pulled out his hunting knife and began working on the lock's mechanism. "Don't rightly know," the boy replied, his voice getting a little stronger. "Folks around here just called me what's on that sign. Been so long since anyone used a real name for me, I near forgot I ever had one." Ezra felt anger rising in his chest like floodwater, but he kept his voice calm and gentle. "Well, that sign's nothing but lies. Every person's got worth, especially young folks like you who got their whole lives ahead of them." The knife blade slipped into a gap in the rusted lock, and Ezra began to work it back and forth. "How long you been in this cage?" The boy thought for a moment, counting on his thin fingers. "Since the snow melted last spring, I reckon. Maybe longer. Hard to keep track of days when they all look the same." 6 months. Ezra's hands tightened on the knife handle. Someone had kept this child locked up like an animal for 6 whole months. "Who put you in here?" "Mining boss named Crane. Silas Crane. Said I was stealing food from the company store." The boy's voice got smaller. "I was hungry, mister. My ma and pa died in the mine collapse last winter, and there wasn't nobody left to take care of me. I was just trying not to starve." "So this Crane fellow, he locked you up instead of helping you?" "Said I was a thief and a burden. Said the sign would remind everyone what I was really worth." The boy's voice cracked a little. "Other miners tried to speak up for me at first, but Crane was the boss. He controlled their jobs, their pay, everything. After a while, folks just stopped looking at me when they walked past." The lock gave way with a loud crack that echoed off the empty buildings. Ezra pulled it free and opened the cage door wide. "Well, you're free now. Come on out of there." But the boy didn't move right away. He sat in the back corner of the cage, staring at the open door like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "You sure it's okay? What if Crane comes back? What if he gets mad at you for letting me out?" "Let me worry about Crane," Ezra said, reaching into the cage with his hand extended. "Come on, son. First step's always the hardest." Slowly, carefully, the boy crawled toward the cage door. His movements were stiff and painful. Months of being cramped in a small space had taken their toll on his young body. When he finally emerged from the cage, unfolding his thin limbs in the mountain sunlight, Ezra had to bite back a curse at what he saw. The boy was nothing but skin and bones, his clothes hanging loose on his tiny frame. His feet were bare and cut from the rough cage floor. His hands shook with weakness, and he could barely stand upright after being hunched over for so long. Without a word, Ezra pulled a piece of jerky from his pack and handed it to the boy. "Eat slow," he warned. "Your stomach ain't used to real food anymore." The boy took tiny bites, chewing carefully and savoring each piece like it was the finest meal he'd ever tasted. Tears started running down his dirty cheeks, but he kept eating. "What's your plan now?" Ezra asked gently. "You got any family anywhere?" Anywhere you can go? The boy shook his head. Ma and Pa were all I had. Came out here from Missouri when I was little, looking for a new start. Guess they found one. Just not the kind they were hoping for. Ezra looked around the abandoned mining camp. Most of the buildings were falling down, their windows broken and their doors hanging open like mouths screaming at the sky. Weeds grew up through the wooden sidewalks, and small animals had made nests in the empty rooms. This place was dead, and there was nothing left here for anyone. Can't leave you here by yourself, Ezra said, more to himself than to the boy. Winter's coming, and this place won't provide shelter for a grown man, let alone a child. I don't want to be a burden, the boy said quickly. I can work. I'm stronger than I look. I can earn my keep. Ezra studied the thin, determined face looking up at him. There was something in the boy's eyes now that hadn't been there before. A spark of life, a glimmer of hope. It reminded Ezra of himself at that age, before the world had beaten him down and taught him that people weren't worth trusting. Tell you what, Ezra said finally. I got a cabin up in the high country, about a day's ride from here. It's not much, but it's warm and dry, and there's always food for anyone willing to work for it. You can come with me for the winter, help me with hunting and trapping. Come spring, we'll figure out what's next. The boy's eyes went wide. You mean it? You'd really take me with you? Name's Ezra McKinnon, Ezra said, extending his hand. And I don't make promises I can't keep. The boy shook his hand with a grip that was weak but determined. I'd like to have a real name again, he said. Been thinking about it while I was in that cage. My pa used to read me stories about a boy named Jack who climbed a magic beanstalk. Always liked that name. Jack it is then, Ezra said with a smile. Jack McKinnon. If you're willing to take my family name until you decide what you want to be called permanent like. Jack's face lit up like sunrise over the mountains. Jack McKinnon, he repeated, testing how the words sounded. I like that. I like that a lot. As they prepared to leave the abandoned camp behind, Ezra couldn't help but look back at the empty cage one more time. The wooden sign still hung from the bars. That terrible word still burned into the wood. Without saying anything, he walked back and ripped the sign free, then threw it on the ground and stomped it into pieces. Some words got no business existing, he told Jack, and that's one of them. They loaded Jack onto Stubborn's back. The boy was so light the mule barely noticed the extra weight. As they started up the mountain trail toward Ezra's cabin, Jack kept looking back over his shoulder at the cage, as if he couldn't quite believe he'd really escaped from it. What if Crane comes looking for me? Jack asked, as they climbed higher into the pine forest. Then he'll find more trouble than he bargained for, Ezra replied grimly. But I don't think he will. Bullies like him usually move on to easier prey when their victims disappear. But even as he said it, Ezra knew he was probably wrong. Men like Crane didn't like having their authority challenged, and freeing the boy was definitely a challenge. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he started planning for the possibility that they might have unwelcome visitors before winter set in for good. For now, though, it was enough to see Jack sitting up straighter on the mule's back, looking around at the forest with interest instead of fear. The boy was asking questions about the different trees, the animal tracks in the mud, the names of the peaks that rose all around them, like giant stone guardians. Is it always this beautiful up here? Jack asked as they crested a ridge and could see for miles across the valley below. Most days, Ezra replied. Sometimes the beauty's gentle, like today. Sometimes it's fierce, like during a blizzard or a thunderstorm. But it's always honest. Mountains don't lie to you or put you in cages or call you names. They just are what they are. Jack nodded seriously, like he was filing that information away for future use. I think I'm gonna like living in the mountains. I think you will too, Ezra said, and realized he meant it. For the first time in 20 years, he was looking forward to having someone to share the long winter evenings with, someone to teach about surviving in the wilderness, someone who might help him remember what it felt like to care about another human being. The trail ahead was steep and rocky, and there would be challenges waiting for them before they reached the safety of the cabin. But for now, it was enough to be moving forward together, leaving the cage and its lies far behind them. The rusted lock fought against Ezra's knife like it had a mind of its own. Metal scraped against metal as he worked the blade into the keyhole. twisting and pushing until something inside finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty mining camp. The boy inside the cage didn't move right away, just watched with those dark eyes that seemed too old for his thin face. "Come on out, son," Ezra said softly, pulling the cage door open. The hinges screamed like wounded animals, but the boy still didn't budge. He sat there pressed against the far side of the cage like he was afraid the whole thing might be some kind of trick. Ezra had seen plenty of scared animals in his time on the mountain. Wild things that had been hurt learned not to trust easy kindness. This boy had that same look, like he was waiting for the trap to snap shut again. So Ezra did what he always did with frightened creatures. He sat down on a nearby rock and waited. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the frost on the wooden buildings around them. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called to its mate. The boy's stomach made a growling sound that could have come from a bear cub. That's when Ezra slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of dried meat. "Hungry?" he asked, holding it out but not moving any closer. The boy's eyes fixed on the food like it was made of gold. His tongue darted out to wet his cracked lips, but still he didn't move from the back of the cage. "Tell you what," Ezra said, setting the jerky on the ground between them. "I'm gonna water my mule. You think about whether you want to stay in that cage or come get some breakfast." He stood up slow and easy, the way he might around a spooked deer. Behind him, he heard the cage creak as the boy finally started to move. Ezra kept his back turned while he led his mule to a small stream that ran behind the buildings. He took his time, letting the animal drink its fill while he listened to the soft sounds of bare feet on dirt. When he turned around, the boy was standing outside the cage, the jerky clutched in both hands like someone might try to take it away. He was smaller than Ezra had first thought, probably no more than 12 years old, with dark hair that hung in his face and clothes that were more holes than fabric. His arms and legs were thin as twigs, and dirt covered him from head to toe. "What's your name, boy?" Ezra asked, coming back with the mule trailing behind him. The child chewed the jerky slowly, like he was trying to make it last forever. "Don't got one that matters," he said between bites. "They called me different things. None of them nice." "What about before? Before you ended up in that cage?" The boy's face went blank for a moment, like he was trying to remember something from a long time ago. "Mama used to call me Jack, after some story she knew. But that was before." "Before what?" "Before the mine fell down. Before everyone died. Before they said I was nobody's problem but still somebody's fault." Ezra felt something twist in his chest. He'd heard plenty of sad stories in his time, but there was something about the way this boy said it. Like he was talking about the weather instead of the worst thing that could happen to a child. "Well, Jack's a fine name," Ezra said. "My name's Ezra McKinnon. I live up in the mountains where the air is clean and there ain't no cages." Jack looked up at him with hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in the wind. "You mean it? About your name being Ezra?" "Course I mean it. Why would I lie about a thing like that?" "Because most folks who talked to me lied. Said they were going to help, then walked away. Said they were going to come back, then never did." Ezra knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "I ain't most folks, Jack, and I keep my word." The boy studied his face like he was trying to read a book written in a language he didn't quite understand. "What you going to do with me?" That was the question, wasn't it? Ezra had come down from his mountain looking for supplies, not looking to take on the care of a half-starved child. He had a life up there. Simple, quiet, peaceful. No complications, no responsibilities to anyone but himself. But looking at Jack standing there in the shadow of that awful cage, Ezra knew he couldn't just walk away. Maybe it was because the boy reminded him of his own son, lost so many years ago to fever. Maybe it was because he'd spent too many nights alone with just the wind for company. Or maybe it was because someone had to stand up and say that no child deserved to be locked in a cage like an animal. "First thing we're going to do is get you cleaned up and fed proper," Ezra said. "Then we're going to figure out what comes next." Jack nodded like this made sense to him. "You got any more of that jerky?" Ezra smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in months. "I got jerky and beans and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. You like coffee?" "Never had any." "Well, that's about to change." As they shared a simple meal beside the stream, Ezra learned pieces of Jack's story. The boy's parents had worked in the copper mine until a cave-in took their lives along with dozens of others. With no family left to claim him, Jack had become what people called a camp orphan. Nobody's responsibility but everybody's problem. They tried putting me with different families, Jack explained, soaking hard biscuits in the stream to soften them. But there wasn't enough food to go around, and I was just another mouth. Some were kind enough, but kind don't fill bellies when winter comes. So how'd you end up in the cage? Jack's face darkened. Started taking food that wasn't mine. Just scraps mostly. Stuff that would have gone to the pigs anyway. But Mr. Crane, he ran the mine company, he said I was setting a bad example. Said if they let one orphan steal, pretty soon they'd all be stealing. So he put you in a cage to teach the others a lesson. That's what he said. Said I'd stay there until I learned my place. Jack looked back at the iron bars glinting in the sunlight. Been there since the snow melted. Figured I'd die there when the snow came back. Ezra felt anger building in his chest like steam in a kettle. He'd known men like this Crane during the war. Men who thought their authority gave them the right to treat others like property. Well, you ain't gonna die in no cage, he said firmly. That's a promise. They spent the rest of the morning going through the abandoned buildings, looking for anything useful. Jack knew which houses had been abandoned quickly, and which ones had been picked clean by scavengers. In one cabin, they found a trunk full of boys' clothes that fit Jack well enough. In another, they discovered a cache of canned goods hidden under loose floorboards. Belonged to the Hendersons, Jack explained as they loaded the supplies onto Ezra's mule. They had 3 boys, but they all got sick with the fever after the mine closed. Mrs. Henderson used to give me apple butter when she had extra. As Jack changed into clean clothes behind a building, Ezra noticed something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the wooden post of the cage were dozens of small marks. Scratches, really. Like someone had been counting days. He counted them quickly. Over 100 marks, each one representing a day this child had spent locked up like an animal. When Jack came back wearing clothes that actually fit, he looked like a different person. Still thin, still carrying the weight of too much sorrow for someone so young, but human again. Like a boy instead of a caged thing. You ready to see some real mountains? Ezra asked, swinging up onto his horse. Jack looked around the mining camp one last time, his eyes lingering on the cage. Then he picked up a rock and threw it hard at the wooden sign, knocking it clean off its post. The word, worthless, landed face down in the dirt. I'm ready, he said. The mountain trail wound upward, like a snake climbing toward heaven, each switchback revealing new wonders that made Jack's eyes grow wide with amazement. He'd lived his whole life in the valley, where the biggest hill was the slag heap behind the copper mine. Now the world spread out below them, like a map drawn by God himself, with rivers threading silver through green meadows and peaks stretching away until they melted into the sky. How far up do we go? Jack asked, walking alongside Ezra's horse while the pack mule followed behind them, loaded with their supplies. My cabin's at about 8,000 feet, Ezra replied, watching the boy's easy stride with approval. Despite months in a cage, Jack moved through the wilderness like he belonged there. Air gets thin up there. Takes some getting used to. Thin how? You'll see. Makes you breathe harder at first. Like you've been running when you ain't moved at all. They stopped to rest beside a creek that tumbled down from the peaks in a series of small waterfalls. Jack knelt by the water and cupped it in his hands, drinking deeply. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache, but it was the cleanest thing he'd ever tasted. This water comes from snow that's been sitting on those peaks since before you were born, Ezra explained, letting his animals drink their fill. Snow melts, slow up high, feeds these streams all summer long. Jack splashed water on his face and looked up at the towering peaks. Do people live up there? On the very top? Nobody lives that high permanent, but some folks climb up there just to see what it's like. Crazy folks, mostly. Have you ever been to the top? Ezra grinned. Maybe once or twice, when I was younger and stupider. As they climbed higher, the air grew cooler and the trees began to change. The scrub oak and cottonwoods of the lower slopes gave way to tall pines that swayed in the wind like they were dancing to music only they could hear. Jack had never seen trees so big or breathed air so clean. Every breath seemed to wash away a little more of the cage's memory. Tell me about where you lived before, Jack said as they walked. Before the mountains, I mean. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and Jack thought maybe he'd asked the wrong question. But then the older man began to speak, his voice soft like he was talking to himself as much as to the boy. Had a farm down in Kansas. Good land, good water. Grew corn mostly, some wheat. Had a wife named Mary and a boy about your age named Samuel. He paused to adjust the pack on his mule. That was before the war came and took everything away. What happened to them? Fever took Samuel while I was away fighting. Mary followed him 6 months later. When I came home, there wasn't nothing left but graves and memories. Jack walked in silence for a while, thinking about parents who died in mine collapses and fathers who lost sons to fever. Is that why you live alone? Because it hurts too much to be around people? Ezra looked down at the boy with surprise. It wasn't the kind of question he'd expected from a 12-year-old. Maybe partly, but also because people can be cruel, and the mountains never are. Mountains might kill you, but they ain't mean about it. The mountains are talking to us right now, Jack said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the trail. What do you mean? Jack pointed to a stand of aspen trees whose leaves were trembling even though there wasn't any wind. Something's coming. Something the trees don't like. Ezra felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The boy was right. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with weather. His horse's ears were pricked forward, alert. The pack mule had stopped chewing and was looking back down the trail. How'd you know that? Ezra asked quietly. You learn to listen when you're locked up and can't move around. The world keeps talking. You just got to pay attention. Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. Something's following us. Ezra dismounted and pressed his ear to the ground, an old trick he'd learned from Indian scouts during the war. Sure enough, there was the faint vibration of horses' hooves on stone, still far below but definitely coming their way. How many you think? He asked Jack. The boy closed his eyes and tilted his head like he was listening to music. 3 horses, moving fast but trying to be quiet about it. Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. 3 men, coming up the mountain trail in pursuit. It couldn't be coincidence, not when they'd just freed Jack from that cage. Someone wanted the boy back, and they were willing to chase him into dangerous country to get him. We need to move, Ezra said, swinging back into his saddle. Trail gets narrow up ahead, with lots of places where rocks could fall. If someone's tracking us, that's where they'll try to make their move. Jack looked scared but determined. Are we running away? We're being smart. There's a difference. Ezra urged his horse forward at a faster pace. But Jack, if shooting starts, you get behind the biggest rock you can find and stay there until I tell you different. They climbed steadily for another hour, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous with each switchback. The trees grew thinner and the rocks grew bigger, until they were traveling through a landscape that looked like the bones of the earth pushing through its skin. Jack kept looking back down the trail, but the pursuing riders stayed just out of sight around the mountain's curve. There, Ezra said, pointing to a cluster of big boulders about 100 yards ahead. We'll make our stand there. Good cover, good view of the trail below. As they reached the rocks, Ezra quickly unloaded his rifle and checked his ammunition. He had maybe 20 rounds, which would have to be enough. Jack helped him position the pack mule and horse behind the biggest boulder, then crouched down beside him. You scared? Ezra asked. Yeah, Jack admitted, but not of them. I'm scared of going back to that cage. That ain't gonna happen, Ezra promised. Whatever else occurs, you ain't going back to that cage. The sound of horses on stone grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. 3 riders came around the bend below them, moving in single file with their rifles across their saddles. The man in front was older, with gray hair and the kind of straight-backed posture that spoke of military training. Behind him rode 2 younger men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. That's far enough, Ezra called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. State your business. The lead rider reined in his horse and looked up at the rocks where Ezra and Jack were hidden. Name's Colonel Marcus Crane, he called back. I'm looking for stolen property. A boy who belongs to the mining company. Don't see no property up here, Ezra replied. Just a free child who was being kept in a cage like an animal. That boy is a ward of the company until he reaches majority age. What you've done is kidnapping, and the law will see it that way. Jack whispered urgently to Ezra. He's lying. There wasn't never no papers making me a ward. He just said that after he put me in the cage. Ezra called down to Crane. Boy says you're lying about them papers. Boy's a thief and a liar. You can't trust nothing, he says. Crane's voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Send him down peaceful, and we'll forget this whole business. Keep him, and you'll hang for kidnapping. Tell you what, Colonel, Ezra shouted back. You show me them ward papers, signed and proper, and maybe we can talk. Until then, you best turn around and head back down the mountain." The three men below had a quick conference, their voices too low to carry up to the rocks. Then Crane called out again, "You got until sundown to think it over, mountain man. After that, we come up there and take what's ours." The riders backed their horses around the bend and out of sight, but Ezra knew they hadn't gone far. They'd be setting up their own camp, waiting for full darkness to make their move. 3 against 1 weren't bad odds in daylight, but at night in rocky country, anything could happen. "What do we do now?" Jack asked. Ezra looked at the boy, really looked at him. In just 2 days, Jack had gone from a broken thing in a cage to a young man with fire in his eyes and steel in his spine. Maybe it had always been there, just waiting for someone to notice. Maybe that's all anyone needed, someone to see them as more than worthless. "Now we get ready to fight," Ezra said, "because some things are worth fighting for, and freedom's at the top of that list." As the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the rocks red and gold, man and boy prepared to defend what they'd found in each other. Not just freedom, but family. The snap of a twig in the darkness below made Ezra's blood turn to ice water. He'd been a mountain man long enough to know the difference between an animal moving through the forest and something much more dangerous. His eyes opened without moving the rest of his body, a skill that had kept him alive through countless nights in hostile territory. The cabin sat perched on a rocky ledge, giving him a clear view of the winding trail that led up from the valley below. 3 horses picked their way carefully up the moonlit path, their riders moving with the quiet confidence of men who'd done this kind of work before. Ezra could make out the glint of rifle barrels in the pale light, and something about the way they held themselves told him these weren't travelers looking for shelter. They were hunters, and they'd found their prey. Jack slept on a pile of furs near the fireplace, his breathing deep, and even for the first time since Ezra had found him. The boy had put on weight over the past weeks, his hollow cheeks filling out, his eyes losing some of their haunted look. But now that peace was about to be shattered, and Ezra felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Moving with the silent grace of a man who'd spent decades avoiding detection, Ezra slipped from his bed and crossed to where his weapons hung. His fingers found the cold metal of his rifle, checking the load by touch alone. 6 shots and 3 men below. The math wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either. He'd need every advantage he could get. "Jack," he whispered, barely breathing the words. The boy's eyes snapped open immediately, alert in the way that spoke of too many nights spent listening for danger. "We got company coming up the trail. 3 riders, armed." The transformation in Jack was immediate and heartbreaking. The relaxed child disappeared, replaced by the caged animal Ezra had first encountered. But there was something else there now too, a steel core that hadn't existed before, forged in the warmth of the cabin and the safety of belonging somewhere. "Are they coming for me?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the fear Ezra could see in his eyes. "I reckon they are," Ezra replied, handing the boy a spare rifle. "But they're gonna have to go through me first, and I ain't planning on making that easy." The sound of voices drifted up from below, still too distant to make out words but close enough to hear the tone. There was laughter in those voices, the cruel kind that came from men who enjoyed their work too much. Ezra had heard that same laughter during the war, usually right before something terrible happened. "Can you see them from the window?" Ezra asked, positioning himself where he could watch both the front door and the narrow path that led to the cabin's back entrance. Jack crept to the small window, peering through a gap in the wooden shutters. "The big one in front has a star on his shirt," he reported. "Looks like a lawman's badge, but it's too dark to be sure." Ezra's jaw tightened. A badge would complicate things, even if it was fake. People in these mountains respected the law, or at least the idea of it. But Ezra had seen enough crooked lawmen to know that a star didn't always mean justice. The horses stopped just outside the circle of light cast by the cabin's windows. Ezra could hear low conversation, the kind of planning that happened before violence. He'd been on both sides of that conversation enough times to recognize it. "McKinnon!" The voice that called out was deep and carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "We know you're in there, and we know you got something that belongs to us. Come out peaceful, and nobody has to get hurt." Ezra exchanged a look with Jack. The boy's face was pale but determined, his small hands gripping the rifle with surprising steadiness. Whatever fear he felt, he wasn't letting it control him anymore. "Don't know what you're talking about, stranger," Ezra called back, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "Just an old man trying to get some sleep." Laughter echoed from below, harsh and mocking. "Old man, maybe, but not alone. We tracked that boy's footprints right to your door. Company's been looking for him since he ran off from Copper Falls. They want their property back." The word property hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd heard people called property before, during his younger days in the South, and the memory of it made his stomach turn. No human being was property, especially not a child who'd already suffered more than any person should. "Boy's not property," Ezra replied, his voice harder now. "He's under my protection, and he's staying that way." "Your protection?" The voice below took on a mocking tone. "You're just one old hermit against 3 armed men. Be smart about this, McKinnon. Hand over the boy, and you can go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Jack moved closer to Ezra, his young face set with determination. "I won't go back to that cage," he whispered. "I'd rather die up here." "Won't come to that," Ezra promised, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. "But if it does, we'll face it together." The minutes stretched out like hours as the standoff continued. Ezra could hear movement below, the soft scrape of boots on stone that told him the men were positioning themselves around the cabin. They were professionals, or at least experienced enough to know how to flush out quarry that had gone to ground. "Last chance, McKinnon," the voice called again. "Send the boy out or we're coming in after him." "Come ahead," Ezra replied, his finger finding the trigger of his rifle. "But you might not like what you find." The attack came from 2 directions at once, just as Ezra had expected. The front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters as one man put his shoulder to it, while another came through the back window in a crash of breaking glass. The third man stayed outside, his rifle trained on the cabin's windows to prevent escape. Ezra's first shot took the man coming through the door center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the cabin floor. His second shot went toward the window, but the intruder had already rolled behind Ezra's table, using it for cover. Jack's rifle cracked from his position near the fireplace, the bullet splintering wood just inches from the hidden man's head. The boy was a better shot than Ezra had expected, his hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Give it up, old man," the voice from outside shouted. "You got nowhere to run, and we got all night." But Ezra had been in worse spots than this, and he hadn't survived 20 years in the mountains by giving up when things got tough. He rolled behind his bed, using the thick log frame for protection as bullets punched through the cabin's walls. The man behind the table made his move, rising up with his pistol drawn. But Jack was ready, his rifle already aimed. The shot was clean and true, catching the intruder in the shoulder and spinning him back against the wall. "Nice shooting," Ezra called to the boy, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. "Now keep your head down." The cabin had become a war zone, filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of burned powder. Furniture lay in splinters where bullets had found their mark, and the cheerful fire that had warmed them through so many peaceful evenings now cast dancing shadows that made every corner a potential hiding place. From outside came the sound of the third man moving, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he circled the cabin looking for a better angle. Ezra tracked the sound, waiting for his chance. "You're trapped in there," the man outside called. "Surrender now, and maybe the company will go easy on the boy." "What company?" Ezra shouted back, genuinely curious. He'd suspected there was more to this than just retrieving a runaway child, and now seemed like a good time to get some answers. "Mountain Mining Consortium," came the reply. "They got legal claim to everything that came out of Copper Falls, including that boy. His parents signed him over as collateral for their mining equipment." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Ezra could see the boy's face crumble as the truth sank in. His parents hadn't just died in a mining accident, they'd signed him away like a piece of property to pay their debts. "That's a lie," Jack whispered, but there was doubt in his voice now, the terrible uncertainty of someone learning that everything they'd believed about their life was wrong. "Even if it's true," Ezra said firmly, "no piece of paper gives them the right to cage a child like an animal. Your parents are dead, boy. Whatever they might have signed don't matter now." The man outside was getting closer, and Ezra could hear him trying to find a way onto the cabin's roof. If he got up there, he'd have a clear shot down through the cabin's single room, and the fight would be over quickly. "Jack," Ezra whispered. "Can you keep that wounded fellow behind the table honest while I deal with the one outside?" The boy nodded, his rifle trained on the overturned table, where their injured attacker was trying to stop his bleeding. "I got him covered." Ezra moved to the door, stepping carefully around the body of the first intruder. The man was still breathing but unconscious, blood pooling beneath him on the cabin's wooden floor. Outside, he could hear the third attacker trying to climb up to the roof, using a pile of firewood as a ladder. The night air was cold against Ezra's face as he eased the broken door open just enough to slip through. Above him, he could hear the scrape of boots on the cabin's log walls as the man made his way upward. Ezra moved silently along the cabin's base, his rifle ready. The shot came from above just as Ezra reached the corner of the building. The bullet gouged a furrow in the ground where he'd been standing a second before. He rolled behind a pile of split logs, returning fire toward the roof. "You can't win this, McKinnon," the man shouted from above. "Even if you kill me, the company will just send more men. That boy belongs to them, legal and proper." "Maybe," Ezra called back, "but they'll have to prove it to someone other than me." The fight continued through the long night. A deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of the cabin. But as dawn approached, bringing with it the pale light of a new day, it became clear that the attackers had underestimated their quarry. The mountain had made Ezra hard, and desperation had made Jack dangerous. The pale light of dawn revealed the true cost of the night's violence. 2 men lay wounded but alive in Ezra's cabin, while the third sat propped against a tree outside, his hands bound with rope and his rifle far out of reach. The smell of gun smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the pine scent of the mountain morning. Ezra stood in his doorway, his rifle cradled in his arms, watching the captured man with eyes that had seen too much violence for one lifetime. The stranger was older than Ezra had expected, maybe 45, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. His badge, now clearly visible in the morning light, looked official enough, but Ezra had learned not to trust appearances. "Name's Silas Crane," the man said, his voice steady despite his situation. "I'm a deputy sheriff out of Denver, and I got legal papers for that boy." Jack emerged from the cabin, moving with the careful alertness of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary. He'd spent the night helping tend to the wounded men's injuries, showing a compassion that surprised even Ezra. There was something about the boy that remained unbroken despite everything he'd endured. "Let's see these papers," Ezra said, his tone suggesting he expected them to be worthless. Crane nodded toward his coat pocket. "Inside vest, left side. Be careful with them, they're the only copies I got." Ezra retrieved the documents, unfolding them in the morning light. The legal language was dense and complicated, but the meaning was clear enough. According to these papers, Jack's parents had indeed signed him over to the Mountain Mining Consortium as collateral for equipment and supplies. When they died in the mine collapse, ownership had passed to the company. "This says his name is Jacob Hartwell," Ezra noted, looking at the boy. "That your real name, son?" Jack's face went pale as old memories surfaced. "Jacob was. That was before," he said quietly. "Before the cage, before everything went wrong. My ma used to call me that." "According to this," Crane continued, "the boy ran off from company property. That makes him a fugitive, and me taking him back is just doing my job." But something about the papers bothered Ezra. The signatures looked fresh, the ink too dark for documents that were supposed to be months old. He'd seen enough forged papers during the war to recognize the signs. "These look mighty fresh for legal documents," Ezra observed, holding the papers up to the light. "Almost like someone wrote them recently." Crane's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but Ezra caught the tell. "Papers get recopied all the time when the originals get damaged," the deputy said. "Doesn't make them any less legal." "Maybe not," Ezra agreed, "but it makes them suspicious. And I'm thinking a real deputy sheriff would have more men with him for something this important. 3 men to bring back one boy seems either too few or too many, depending on how you look at it." The wounded men in the cabin were stirring now, their groans carrying through the broken doorway. One of them called out weakly, "Crane, we need a doctor." "Your friends there need medical attention," Ezra pointed out. "Nearest doc is 2 days' ride down the mountain. You planning to let them die up here for the sake of one boy?" Crane's jaw worked as he considered his options. The morning sun was climbing higher, and with it came the promise of another cold mountain day. His men were hurt, His mission had failed, and he was at the mercy of a man who had every reason to kill him. "What do you want?" Crane asked finally. "Truth," Ezra replied simply. "Real truth, not whatever story you've been paid to tell." Jack moved closer to the two men, his young face serious. "If those papers are real, then my parents really did sign me away, but that don't explain the cage, or why they called me worthless." Crane looked at the boy for a long moment, something flickering across his features that might have been shame. "The cage," he started, then stopped, as if the words were too difficult to say. "Go on," Ezra encouraged, his rifle still ready, but no longer directly threatening. "The cage was Supervisor Hammond's idea," Crane admitted. He said the boy needed to be taught his place, that running off had to have consequences. I told him it was wrong, but Hammond, he owns a piece of the mining company. What he says goes." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jack's face went through a series of emotions: hurt, anger, and finally a kind of sad understanding that made him look older than his 12 years. "So I really am just property to them," Jack said quietly. "A thing to be owned and punished and locked up when I don't behave." "Not to me you ain't," Ezra said firmly, "and not to anyone who matters." Crane shifted uncomfortably against the tree. "Look, McKinnon, I got a job to do, but maybe there's another way to handle this." "I'm listening," Ezra said. "The company wants the boy back because he represents an investment. They spent money on his parents, and they want to recoup their losses by putting him to work in the mines. But what if they got their money back another way?" Ezra raised an eyebrow. "You suggesting I buy the boy's freedom?" "I'm suggesting we all walk away from this mess before it gets worse," Crane replied. "I got wounded men who need a doctor. You got a boy who needs protecting, and the company needs to cut their losses. Sometimes the best solution is the one where everybody gets something they can live with." It wasn't justice, Ezra knew. Real justice would have meant punishment for the men who'd caged a child and called him worthless. But in the mountains, survival often mattered more than justice, and keeping Jack safe was more important than settling scores. "How much?" Ezra asked. $100, Crane replied. "That's what the company figures they lost on the boy's parents." It was more money than Ezra had seen in years, but he had gold dust hidden in the cabin, savings from decades of trapping and trading. The question was whether he could trust Crane to honor the bargain. "I want those papers," Ezra said. "The real ones and any copies. And I want your word that the company won't come looking for him again." "You got it," Crane agreed quickly. "But I need to get my men to a doctor, and you need to get that money. How do we do this without somebody getting shot?" Jack stepped forward then, his young voice carrying a surprising note of authority. "I got an idea," he said. "But first, I want to hear Deputy Crane admit something." Crane looked puzzled. "Admit what?" "That putting a child in a cage is wrong, no matter what any paper says. That calling someone worthless don't make it true." The deputy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes meeting Jack's steady gaze. When he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all morning. "It was wrong," he said simply. "What Hammond did to you was wrong, and I should have stopped it. A badge is supposed to mean something, and I let mine become just a piece of metal." The words seemed to lift some invisible weight from Jack's shoulders. He stood straighter, his chin coming up in a gesture that reminded Ezra of the man the boy might someday become. "All right then," Jack said. "Here's what we're gonna do." The plan the boy outlined was simple but effective. Ezra would ride down the mountain with the wounded men, ostensibly to get them medical help, but really to retrieve his gold and finalize the transaction. Crane would stay at the cabin with Jack, his weapons secured but his men's lives serving as insurance against any treachery. "You trust him to stay here with me?" Ezra asked Jack quietly. "I trust you taught me enough to handle myself if he tries anything," Jack replied with a small smile. "Besides, he's got hurt men depending on him. Even a crooked deputy wouldn't let his own people die." It was a risk, but it was the kind of calculated gamble that survival in the mountains often required. As Ezra prepared for the ride down to the valley, he found himself looking at Jack with new eyes. The caged, frightened child he'd rescued was becoming something else, someone who could face his fears and find solutions where others saw only problems. The morning sun climbed higher, as the unlikely group prepared to resolve their conflict not through violence but through the kind of hard compromise that was sometimes the best anyone could hope for. It wasn't the ending Ezra would have chosen, but it was one that might let all of them sleep peacefully again. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass, and Jack felt his whole world change in that single heartbeat. Crane's bullet whistled past Ezra's ear so close it singed his gray hair. But the old mountain man was already moving, rolling behind the woodpile with the fluid grace of someone who had danced with death before and lived to tell about it. "Stay down, boy!" Ezra shouted. But Jack was no longer the trembling child who had cowered in that cage. Something fierce and wild had awakened in him during these months with Ezra. Something that refused to hide, while the only person who had ever shown him kindness faced 3 armed men alone. The second shooter, a thin man with nervous eyes, fired wild shots that splintered the cabin's logs and sent wood chips flying like angry hornets. His hands shook so badly that Jack could see the rifle barrel wavering even in the dim moonlight. This wasn't a killer, Jack realized. With sudden clarity, this was just a scared man following orders he didn't believe in. But Crane was different. The way he moved spoke of violence done easily and often, his gun steady in hands that had never trembled at taking another's life. He circled toward the cabin's front door with the patient cunning of a wolf, while his third companion tried to flank around the back through the pine trees. Jack's mind raced faster than his frightened heart. The cabin had only 2 exits, and these men knew it. They were trying to trap him and Ezra like animals in a den, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. The boy's fingers tightened on the rifle Ezra had given him, remembering every lesson about breathing steady and aiming true. "Come out, old man," Crane called, his voice carrying the false cheer of someone enjoying a deadly game. "Bring the boy, and maybe you live to see morning. Keep him, and I promise you both, a slow death that these mountains will remember long after your bones turn to dust." Ezra's response came not in words but in action, a carefully aimed shot that knocked the hat clean off the nervous man's head and sent him diving for cover behind a boulder. The message was clear. The mountain man wouldn't go down easy, and anyone who wanted the boy would have to pay a price in blood. But Jack saw what Ezra couldn't from his position behind the woodpile. The third man had made it to the cabin's back wall and was now creeping along the logs toward the rear door, a long knife glinting in his hand. In moments, he would be inside, and then Ezra would be caught between 3 enemies with nowhere to turn. The boy made his choice without thinking, slipping out through the cabin side window with the silence Ezra had taught him during their hunting trips. His bare feet found the cold ground without a sound, and he began working his way through the shadows toward the man with the knife. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, not from the rocky ground but from the terror that threatened to freeze his muscles solid. This wasn't shooting at bottles or hunting deer for supper. This was real violence, the kind that left people dead and buried in unmarked graves. But the memory of that cage, of the worthless sign and the endless days of hunger and despair, pushed him forward step by trembling step. The man at the back door never heard him coming. Jack's first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain and surprise that echoed off the mountain walls. The knife flew from nerveless fingers to clatter against the cabin logs, and suddenly the odds had shifted in their favor. "Behind you!" Jack yelled to Ezra, and the old mountain man spun with reflexes that belied his age, his rifle speaking twice in rapid succession. The nervous shooter's weapon went flying as Ezra's bullet shattered the stock, while a second shot sent the man scrambling for better cover among the pine trees. But Crane had used the distraction to gain the cabin's front porch, and now he stood in the doorway like death itself, his gun trained on the spot where Jack crouched beside the wounded man. The boy found himself staring down that black barrel, seeing his own death reflected in the cold metal. "Drop your weapon, boy," Crane said softly, his voice carrying the terrible certainty of someone who had never failed to get what he wanted. "Drop it, or I paint these cabin walls with your brains and take my time with the old man afterward." Jack's hands began to shake as the full weight of the moment crashed down on him. This was it, the test that would prove whether he was truly worthless or whether Ezra's faith in him had been justified. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in his small hands, and for a heartbeat he wavered on the edge of surrender. Then he remembered Ezra's words from that first day. Every man gets to choose what he's worth. The boy's hand steadied, and when he looked up at Crane, his young voice carried the iron strength of mountains themselves. "No," Jack said simply. "I ain't dropping nothing for you." The next few seconds stretched like hours. Crane's finger began to tighten on the trigger, his face twisting with the ugly pleasure of someone about to crush something beautiful just because he could. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had forgotten about Ezra McKinnon, and mountain men never forgot their enemies. Ezra's shot took Crane's center mass, the impact driving him backward off the porch to land hard in the dirt yard. The man's gun flew wide, its bullet burying itself harmlessly in a pine tree, and suddenly the night was quiet except for the wounded man's labored breathing and the distant call of a night bird somewhere in the darkness. Jack stood frozen, hardly believing they had survived. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers to clatter on the cabin steps, and he felt his legs go weak with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. But when Ezra's strong hand fell on his shoulder, the boy looked up to see something new in the old man's eyes, not just affection, but respect. "You did good, son," Ezra said quietly. And somehow those 4 words meant more than all the praise Jack had ever imagined receiving. Real good. The winter that followed the gunfight settled over their mountain cabin like a thick wool blanket, sealing them away from the world below with walls of snow that rose higher than a man's head. But instead of the crushing loneliness that had marked Ezra's previous winters, this season brought something the old mountain man had forgotten existed: the warm companionship of family. Jack proved to be a different child than the broken boy Ezra had found in that cage. Away from the cruelty and fear that had shaped his early years, his natural curiosity bloomed like wildflowers after spring rain. He asked endless questions about everything from why snow crystals formed different patterns to how Ezra had learned to read the weather in cloud formations and wind direction. "Tell me about the war again," Jack would say during the long evenings by the fire, and Ezra found himself sharing stories he had kept buried for decades. Not the horrible parts, the boy had seen enough violence for one lifetime, but the moments of brotherhood and courage that had somehow survived even in the darkest times. In return, Jack began to open up about his own past, painting word pictures of parents who had loved him dearly before the mine collapse took them away. His father had been a reader, he explained, which was why Jack took to books so naturally. His mother had taught him to see kindness as strength rather than weakness, a lesson that had kept his spirit alive even in that terrible cage. "She used to say that being gentle don't make you soft," Jack told Ezra one snowy evening as they worked together preparing rabbit stew. "Said it takes more courage to help someone than to hurt them, because helping makes you responsible for what happens next." Ezra nodded, stirring the pot while he considered the boy's words. His own mother had died when he was barely older than Jack, and he had spent so many years hard and alone that he had forgotten what gentleness looked like. But watching Jack tend to injured animals they found during their winter hunts, seeing him share his food with the cabin's resident mice instead of setting traps, the old mountain man began to remember parts of himself he thought the war had killed forever. The boy proved remarkably capable at mountain survival, his small size and quick mind making him an ideal partner for winter hunting and trapping. He could slip through brush too thick for Ezra's bulk, could spot animal tracks in conditions where even the experienced mountain man struggled to read sign. More importantly, he seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when to push forward and when to retreat, a quality that kept them both safe during the dangerous winter months. But it was the evenings that truly changed everything. Jack had inherited his father's love of reading, and Ezra's small collection of books became treasures to be shared and discussed long into the night. They read together by firelight, everything from practical guides about wilderness survival to adventure stories that took them far beyond their mountain valley. "What's it like down in the towns?" Jack asked one night, after they had finished reading about distant cities and bustling harbors. "All them people living so close together?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, remembering his own younger days before war and loss had driven him to seek solitude in the high country. "Noisy," he finally said. "Full of folks trying to get ahead by stepping on others. But there's good people too, son. People who'd help a stranger just because it's the right thing to do. Like you helped me," Jack said softly. "Like you helped me right back," Ezra replied, and meant it more than the boy could know. As winter deepened and the snows piled higher around their cabin, they developed routines that felt as natural as breathing. Mornings began with checking the trap lines and hunting for fresh meat. Afternoons were spent maintaining their gear and preparing for the next day's work. And evenings belonged to books and stories and the kind of easy conversation that came only between people who truly trusted each other. Jack learned to read the mountain weather with the same skill Ezra had developed over decades of survival. He could predict storms hours before they arrived, could tell by the way animals behaved when a hard freeze was coming, could even sense the subtle changes that meant winter was finally beginning to loosen its grip on the high country. "You got a gift for this life," Ezra told him one morning as they tracked an elk through fresh powder snow. "Most folks who try to live up here don't last a season, but you take to it like you were born for these mountains." Jack beamed at the praise, but then his expression grew thoughtful. "What happens when spring comes?" he asked. "When the snow melts and the passes open up again?" It was a question Ezra had been dreading, though he hadn't admitted it even to himself. By law and custom, the boy needed schooling, needed to be around other children, needed opportunities that life in an isolated mountain cabin could never provide. But the thought of returning to his old solitude, of watching Jack disappear into a world that had already proven it could be cruel to someone small and defenseless, filled the old mountain man with a pain deeper than any physical wound. "We'll figure it out when the time comes," Ezra said finally. "But whatever happens, you remember this: you ain't worthless, boy. Not by any measure that matters." On Christmas morning, Ezra presented Jack with the carved wooden sign he had worked on secretly during the boy's sleeping hours. When Jack saw his new name, Jack McKinnon, burned carefully into the smooth pine board, tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. "Every man needs a name that carries weight," Ezra said gruffly, suddenly self-conscious about the gesture. "And McKinnon's been a good name for 3 generations. Figured it might serve you well, too." Jack threw his arms around the old mountain man's neck, and Ezra felt something break open in his chest, not painful, but like ice giving way to spring warmth. For the first time in 20 years, Christmas felt like more than just another day to survive. "I got something for you too," Jack said shyly, producing a small object he had carved from a piece of antler shed by one of the local elk. It was a tiny figure of a man and boy standing together, rough but recognizable, and when Ezra took it in his weathered hands, he felt tears threaten for the first time since the war. "It's us," Jack explained unnecessarily, "so you'll remember that you ain't alone no more neither." As spring slowly returned to the Colorado high country, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes that had kept them isolated through the winter months, both man and boy had been transformed in ways that went deeper than the changing seasons. They had discovered that worth wasn't something written on signs or declared by others. It was something built through daily choices, through kindness offered and received, through the decision to see value in oneself and others, even when the world insisted otherwise. The mountains had witnessed many transformations over the centuries, but perhaps none more profound than the one that turned a bitter hermit and a caged boy into something neither had dared hope for: a real family, bound not by blood but by choice, not by law but by love, not by the past but by the future they would build together, one day at a time.